Our next author tonight is Delilah Marvelle. I'm going to set aside the script for just a second. Is that okay? I'm going to go 7 years ago. 7 years ago? Would that be about right? Okay.
6, at most 7.
Okay.
Yeah.
I was getting into writing. I'm sort of looking into the whole being an author and what's it like. And I discovered that at Jan's Paperbacks at Nebbie's place, Delilah is having a signing. So I show up there, and there's about 50 women there, and they're all over the age of 50. That's our audience, right?
Here, here,
It really was.
tread lightly.
But I was there, and that was the audience, and it was great. And yes,
Can I just say, he was hiding in the corner.
I was hiding.
He was scared to death.
But I watched Delilah come out in this dress that was like sort of a Victorian age dress. She had her hair all done up. It was wonderful. And I watched that and I thought, that's how you do it. That's how you do it. And she did a great job. And so I've talked to Delilah since then, and she's done well for herself. Okay. That was my first memory of Delilah. Okay. Delilah Marvelle spent her youth studying various languages, reading voraciously, and playing the pianoforte. She confesses that here the extent of her was the end of her gentle breeding. I love this next part. She was a naughty child who was forever torturing her parents with countless adventures that they did not deem respectful. Love it. Confined to her room on many occasions due to these misadventures, she discovered the quill and its amazing power. Soon to the dismay of her parents, she rather enjoyed being confined to her room and finished writing her first historical romance, which was a heart-stopping 800 pages long.
There's a lot of romance in there.
Yeah, that is. At the age of 14, even.
Single space.
Huh?
Single space.
Oh my God.
Really?
Yeah, really. On a
I was
typewriter.
going to say. Gosh. Delilah is the winner of the Reviewer's Choice Award for Best Historical Romance of the Year and was voted Booklist's top 10 romances of 2012.
Thank you for the introduction. Thank you everyone for coming. Thank you Bards and Brews, Red Rose and Cavalry. Thank you Tina as always for putting on a fabulous show and coming out and all the hard work you do. And thank you Debbie for being out. I'm going to start by saying I thought the introduction was worthy. I've always been drawn to the naughty. My parents were such that they never discussed sex with me at all in the generation that I grew up with. And it was to the point that at the age of 15 I thought, quite literally, and I'm not joking, that a girl got pregnant when she got kissed. So I was probably the only girl in high school, an all-girls high school, that literally thought that until we had sex education. Like, what? I was in for a rude awakening, and that's what happens when you're a first-generation born Polish girl on top of it, so there are a lot of jokes on top of that. So, that said, I've always been writing. Everybody asks a lot of writers where they get their inspiration from, and I think it's pretty obvious to say life. You can't write about life if you haven't lived it. And one of my favorite quotes is actually from Hemingway, which is when he was asked what makes for a great writer, his answer was, an unhappy childhood. And it's so true. If you talk to any writer, they have lived life to some extent. I mean, you have there's not a writer that I know that hasn't lived life, not necessarily to its fullest, but there are tragedies, and those tragedies translate to the page. Writing for me is free therapy, and I can probably readily say that about a lot of writers. It's a form of therapy, and we write for a reason, and because a lot of times, we quiet the voices in our heads, characters that appear out of nowhere. I was also the child who my father would read fairy tales, and of course he read the traditional Grimm's fairy tales, which warped my way of thinking quite quickly, as well as Hans Christian Andersen, which was another form of, and I never liked how a lot of them ended, and would kind of contort and change them to my own thing. Would rewrite books. Peter Pan, I totally rewrote that. When they released the movie Hook, that was my book. I had written at the age of 8. So that's how I always approached it, and in particular, I was always drawn to romance. To make a long story short, I had met my husband. I was 17 years old when I met my husband. And I was one of those people that I had grown up very quickly because I grew up in my stepmother was bipolar. And she was undiagnosed for 9 years, which made for a very traumatic upbringing. Fortunately, my father didn't marry her until I was 10. So I grew up with 10 comfortable years of my little life before she came along. And that's when I understood Grimm's fairy tales really, really well. The whole stepmother thing was real in my mind. Romance to me started taking a different turn in seeing especially the tragedy of my father's relationship with my stepmother. I told myself that I would never, ever kneel to a relationship like that, even if it meant that I was going to be single till I was 70. And I was fortunate to find the love of my life at the age of 17. It was almost like God's like, you're not waiting until 70, come on, you hurry it up now. And I feel truly blessed. So I married young, and at 19 was the best thing I ever did. And it's why I write romance. Romance saved my life. And in many ways, my husband swept me off my feet and out of a household that literally had taken me to the brink of suicide twice. The fact that I'm staying here, that's why your story resonated with me. There are different forms of bullying. It can come from your childhood mates, it could come from high school, or it come from within your own family to the point where you feel you have nothing to do except but quite literally end your life. Fortunately, I didn't have to go down that path. My husband began my life. And so I feel very blessed. And that's why I write romance. And that's why I write sex, too. I feel like a lot of people ask, well, because you write slut. No, I don't, actually. I write the true meaning of a relationship. And you guys are fooling yourselves if you think that writing about sex is smut, because every single one of us get into a relationship, and that's when it becomes real. That's when we take off our clothes. It's the first time that you are real with the person you're in a relationship with. That's when we become who we really are. Nobody sees us with our clothes off. Hopefully, not everybody. The way your significant other does, and that's why I write it into my books, because I feel like that's another character arc that cannot be touched in any other way. In a relationship. If you're going to talk about relationships, you cannot leave the sex out, in my opinion. That's my take on it. So that said, I'm not actually going to read from my book. I'm going to do a quick history of why I wrote this series, because I'm obsessed with sexual history. And there's a whole story, and a lot of it can't stem from the fact that I was kept from the idea of sex for so long that when I was finally introduced to it, the idea of sexual history fascinates me from a female perspective, and how uneducated in history they were. And I kind of compared it to myself, and here I was in modern day, and up until 15 I thought that by kissing a boy I could get pregnant. And I'm like, boy, I think a lot of people need an education about the history of sex in general. So, Romancing Lady Stone, and yes, I ripped off Romancing the Stone, just the title, mind you, is one of the books. It's 6 books, and it's the School of Gallantry series. And I write historicals. And the whole basis of the series is connected by a school, it's in 1830, that educates men in the topic of love and seduction. Because men need all the education they can get, right? And it's taught by an elderly courtesan, whom I named Madame de Maintenon. Now, mind you, so it sounds rather outlandish that you would have a school in 1830 that would educate men in the topic of love and seduction, but I actually took it from a page of history. And Nina de l'Enclos is actually who Madame de Maintenon is inspired this, and my grandmother, and I'll get to my grandmother in a second, because she's a whole other character. So Nina de l'Enclos was a 17th century courtesan. And she kind of disappeared in a lot of the pages of history. I stumbled upon her name while researching for another book. And in trying to research more about her, now with the internet, it became a little easier, but still there's a lot of stuff that's written in French about her because that's where she's from, but not a lot of English or Western world has taken an interest in her like they have with Cora Pearl and other famous courtesans that have kind of swept through the pages. And yet, comparing her, Nina de l'Enclos, to all these other courtesans who were famous, she by far stole the show. And so it started with her where she was orphaned at the age of 12. Her father was sent outside the country for fighting in a duel. Back then it became illegal after a certain point. And he died abroad, and that left her with her mother. And when her mother died, she was sent to a convent and until she became of age. And she decided to run away from the convent, and she had enough. And back then, when a woman wanted to be independent, she had one of 2 choices to either basically stay in that convent or become a prostitute or a courtesan. And she said, better to become a prostitute than a nun. that was her opinion, because she felt that she would be kept away from the world. She wanted to experience the world, even if it meant heartache and tragedy and seeing the dirtier side of the world. And she saw a lot of the world and slowly made her way up. Her claim to fame was without any doubt that she was able to be witty with the dukes and the kings of France, to talk to Joe Schmo down the street, a cobbler, and treat them the same, as if they were all royalty. Men loved her, and it wasn't just the sexual aspect of her. So she started, she was actually a big supporter of the literacy arts, and started a huge group in which the men would come and they would discuss, quite literally became like a school in which they would discuss love, relationships, and sex. And back then, men did not have a lot of women to talk to about. You did not talk to your wife about sex. You had sex with your wife for the creation of children, but you really didn't talk to her. And you didn't talk to your sister because that was disrespectful. You didn't talk to your mother about it. Kind of reminds me of the way I grew up. You just didn't talk to anybody. And so back then, even more so. So these men felt that she was their outlet, and having her experience, and she was able to teach them and educate them and guide them. And very, very fascinating lady. I chose her older part of her life because that is where the elderly courtesan, she became more fascinating. So she did have one child, and with a duke. And that duke made her swear that she would never disclose that this was her child. So he raised her. She had to watch her child grow up from a distance, which was tragic in and of itself. But it became even more tragic when this son showed up on her doorstep wanting sex. True. And the mother complex kind of took a whole different turn there. And she knew at that point, when he kept coming to her door over and over, like, why are you're not turning any of these men away? Why do you keep turning me away? What's wrong with me? She finally broke down and told him the truth, that she was his mother. And he quite literally fell upon his own sword. He committed suicide. And that was something she had to live with. She shut herself away, and actually for a little over a year went into mourning for her son, and felt guilty that her lifestyle had ultimately killed her own son. But from it she grew. And if it were not for Nina de Lenclos, you would not have heard of Voltaire. That's how amazing this woman was. And so I sprinkle, Voltaire was not his actual real name. That was his rhyming name. He was the son of an accountant, and the accountant that kept the records for Nina de Lenclos. And she thought this child was so brilliant and needed to be educated, and left a good portion of her money to this accountant's son, who grew up to be Voltaire. So his education and all his, and she left all of her books to him as well. So very fascinating piece of history. So that's kind of the stemming from. I don't know how much more time I have. There is so much in history that is hidden. There's so much in history that I'm drawn to. Yes, I write romance, but it's literally the hidden parts of history, stuff that you were never taught in history classes that fascinate me. Well, let's see. I'm going to pick one extra part in history because there's so many of them. Okay, we'll do this. This is a little fun. So in 1873, there was a new fad. This is what I'm drawn to. I'm drawn to the weird. There was a fad called hiving. Does anybody know what the fad was about? Hiving. Man, they should teach this in high school. So what hiving was it came supposedly from the Orient, and it was a way of keeping your chastity while still experiencing the ultimate physical pleasure. And so what was done was you would put honey on your clitoris, this was for females, and introduce several bees to the honey in order to get the stinging sensation. It's supposed to give you amazing euphoria. Now this is the Victorian period, mind you. So I'm going to read you an excerpt from Harper's Bazaar issue from March of 1873. I love how they sum this up. A tablespoon of honey is dabbed on the vagina with a silk handkerchief. The jar containing the bees then placed under the honey canal, attracting the insects. I observed this ritual in the back room of a playhouse in Kensington. A young woman, who shall remain nameless as to conceal her good name, prepares to receive the 4 insects. Sharp stings yield cries of pain, eventually tears. The practice of hiving has been advertised as originating in the Orient, as a way to receive pleasure whilst maintaining chastity. Advertisements in newspapers trumpet saying like, quote-unquote, intense ecstasy and, quote-unquote, superior than virile males. The Archbishop of Canterbury has condemned the craze, calling it, quote-unquote, ungodly. The Queen has made no official comment, but rumors circulate in taverns that a midnight shipment of beehives have entered Buckingham Palace. Eventually it was exposed, and quite literally within the year it was exposed as a complete fad, and they dismissed that. But these are the little things that I love. There's so much of this, it's ridiculous, and I sprinkle them throughout my books because they have to go somewhere. And one of these days, I plan on actually writing a book on sex and history. I do have a blog called A Bit of Muslim, in which I post to on all the unusual things I find. One of my favorites, too, in closing, will be, for instance, condoms, the history of condoms. When they were first made, they were made from the linen of, they were either made linen, like they found, for instance, King Tut, they found his condom. If you ever wanted to see his condom, because they would bury, in Egyptian times, they believed that your afterlife would come with you. So you had to bring your condom if you wanted to have sex in the afterlife. So, and it is made out of linen, and it wrapped around the waist, very ugly looking thing. And it kind of morphed then into pigskin, and where they would use kind of like what you think of sausage links, quite literally. And you had to moisten it with milk and soak it with milk. And that morphed in the 1600s, where you would have condom shops. And interestingly enough, they were all led by women. And how they would test them is that they would blow them up to make sure that there were no holes.